All right, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Amber Hartwell and I am a doctoral student, University of Calgary alumni and K-12 school teacher. Especially in these times of physical distancing and virtual connections, I like to think about who I'm sharing this space with now, both near and far. We are broadcasting from Calgary, which is located on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7. Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. The University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that is the traditional Blackfoot name known as Mohkinstsis, which we now call the city of Calgary. I am joining you from the traditional territory of the Okanagan peoples in Kelowna, British Columbia. Thank you for joining us today for Implications of Learning in a Digital Age. This is just one of more than 25 virtual programs being held throughout September for Alumni Month. Our alumni's passion, vision, and involvement in the community here and around the world elevate UCalgary's reputation as a global leader and change maker. In celebration of our 190,000 strong UCalgary alumni community, we have curated an exciting selection of programs featuring alumni who will inspire you, conversations that will inform you, and expertise that will guide you. I encourage everyone to check out the entire Alumni Month schedule at alumni.ucalgary.ca/alumni-month. I would also like to introduce my co-presenter, Dr. Barbara Brown, my mentor and advisor, as well as the Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning in the Workland School of Education. Our engagement opportunity will address learning in a digital age and what this means for parents, teachers, researchers, and the broader community with the uncertainties of a global pandemic. Dr. Brown will draw on her research where she has conducted interviews and focus groups with teachers, principals, and superintendents in Alberta during May and June of this school year. Themes emerging from the data analysis offer lesson learns and help dispel many of the myths related to online learning. Dialogue with educators and school leaders in the midst of school building closures and dealing with a quick pivot to remote learning provided insights about the inequities with a one-size-fits-all model for learning. I will also provide a firsthand account of what it was like being a student in a course that quickly transitioned online, as well as some of the realities of back to school this fall. Overall, in this session, you will consider your role and how you can take action to ensure all learners are provided with equitable access to future-ready learning opportunities in a digital age. Our program will be 1 hour in length, 30 to 45 minutes for the program, and approximately 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. Let's get started.
Great, thank you, Amber. Okay, so I'm going to actually go on to the next slide here and talk a little bit about some of the emerging themes that we noted in some of the research that has been conducted. Now, one of the things that I do want to mention is that there's a large research team working under the leadership of Dr. Sharon Friesen and Dr. Jim Brandon, as well as researchers across Alberta that have been conducting research in a longitudinal study. And part of our research is looking at how the professional standards are being implemented in school jurisdictions across Alberta. And so the professional standard is implemented for teachers. There's a teaching quality standard, leadership quality standard, and one for superintendents as well. And part of our research involved conducting focus groups and interviews in the spring of this year. And one of the things we noticed is that a lot of the data that we collected also responded to COVID and the implications of learning in this particular time. And so I will draw on some emerging themes based on some of the focus groups and interviews that I conducted in 2 of the case studies. And I'd like you to note that it is emerging. And so we're continuing to analyze the data. And so these aren't final findings, but some of them certainly do have implications. And so we were asking our participants about their understanding of optimal learning for all students, and how has that changed, or what has resulted in terms of the recent events in education. And so many of the educators that we interviewed shared their experiences about how they managed during this time period. And they also talked to us about how this has had implications in terms of the ways in which they're able to continue business in the school and continue trying to meet the standards. So Amber, I'm going to ask you at this point to just jump in for a moment and talk a little bit about how taking a degree with, most classes in an online format. So in your master's program, you did take a degree that had a lot of online classes, and this was a few years ago. So I'm wondering, how did that influence your definition of optimal learning?
Thanks, Barb. Yeah, so as Barb mentioned, I had the pleasure of taking my Master's of Ed Tech through the University of Calgary, where the majority of my classes were distance-based, except for in the summer where I attended summer institutes. What I will say is, for me, taking my first online course was a significant adjustment for me. I did not like the entire format of it but I really discovered after a while it was because I was used to that traditional face-to-face model. And what I was missing and what I was struggling with at the beginning of the program was not the face-to-face instruction, so how I was having the instruction delivered to me, but rather it was the physical connections and the physical relationships that I was able to make in the face-to-face environment. That ability to go up and just ask my instructor a question on the side face-to-face, which I had grown comfortable with. So for me, it was a learning curve in terms of understanding how to access the support and the extra help that I needed. And much like anything else, I had to be taught how to do that in an online environment. So once I understood the different options that I had, such as virtual office hours and coffee room chats in D2L learner management systems, I began to grow quite fond and comfortable with the online format because it provided me with the ability to have a lot more flexibility in my learning. So I was able to have a lot more say over the pace and when and where I learned. So for me, when going through that program, my definition of optimal learning changed quite a bit because of my experiences with learning online and understanding that I could learn in that format, and in some ways I could learn better in that format. I recognized, and this was in 2012, when I started my master's, I recognized the need to introduce blended learning formats into all of my classes with my students in K-12. And I found that really helped with reaching the diverse learners that I had in my classes. So those learners who were ELL or with disabilities or had different learning style preferences. But even those students who would take extended holidays so they could continue to learn along with the class while they were gone. And since that experience, I have been a tremendous advocate of having some form of online course shell or course classroom to help support students, even if we are in a face-to-face context, just in case our learners can't be with us face-to-face, or if they want to pursue learning again or review things on their own time.
Thanks, Amber. I think it's important to hear how grad studies had implications for you as a teacher and the types of changes you made, and how optimal learning changed for you in terms of the definition. And we heard the same thing from our participants in this study, and how just even that very brief experience in the spring, having to shift to a remote learning situation, changed the way that they were looking at what optimal learning is and how to provide an equitable learning experience for students. And so I'm going to share with you some of the emerging findings that we were looking at. So one being a collective disposition and wellness as a community. And so there's some quotes there from some of the participants to demonstrate for you some of the things that were noted. So a common feature, regardless of jurisdiction or size of the school district, whether public school, Catholic school, rural, urban, private, charter, and these are all part of our study. What we noticed is that there was a focus on wellness and an emphasis on caring for all students as a whole. And I think we continue to see that as schools have returned back to school in a variety of different formats, that there's this continued focus on wellness, as there should be. So what we can learn from the spring is that there were struggles. Some students thrived in the emergency remote learning situation, as I'll call it, and others did not. And we definitely heard this from our participants. Overall, when they reflected on their experience from the spring, the participants noted that there was a higher level of satisfaction than anticipated. So that's good news, considering that teachers, schools were not prepared to move fully online and did this in a very quick way. So as I mentioned, with wellness continuing to be a focus for our students and families, we need to be on the lookout for ways to support that in our communities. So, this may be a perfect time of year, for example, to reconsider some of the procedural functions that we might have in schools. Question, do we need to do them now? Could we hold off? Maybe it's something that we would do next year instead of having to do everything that we normally do. So for example, schools are reconsidering ways to host parent-teacher interviews. Does the meet and greet need to happen right now in September, or could we hold off? Professional growth plans that we normally ask of our teachers to create at this time of year, is it something that could be delayed? I know that standardized exams often are discussed. Is it necessary to have these when we know that school is not going to be conducted in the same ways that it normally is? The next theme that we noticed was digital literacies and professional collaboration skills. So when we asked participants in terms of some of the things that they noted during this time frame, one of the things that was loud and clear, and Amber, you mentioned this, how just even taking an online course as part of your program then impacted the ways in which you were using digital technologies in your class, and with maybe more of an emphasis on digital literacies. And so our participants also noticed this, that there was an improvement in, again, a short period of time, and there was a noted improvement around digital literacy skills, both for teachers and for students. And this is what they observed. So a common comment from our participants was also that they were collaborating more. So noticing that teachers in their schools and across schools were taking this opportunity to work together to solve problems, to together design learning in an online space, which for many of them was very new. And so it required this professional collaboration. What we didn't hear so much of, and maybe this would take more time, is the collaboration among students. I know that we often talk about online learning, perhaps not being able to support students in collaborating as much or working in groups as they would in a face-to-face environment. And one of the things that the teachers noticed is that they were able to collaborate more. And so perhaps with more time, students too would be viewed as collaborating a bit more. Next, I'll talk about the personal connections, communications, and relationships. And again, some of the quotes there illustrate what was noticed by our participants. That, you know, teachers were connecting more with students in a more individualized and personalized way to check in and make sure they were okay, to work on learning or skills that were required on a more individual basis. Participants also discussed the relationships with families being a little bit different than they were pre-COVID, in the sense that they recognized that they needed to work together as a community, and that there were many more communications that occurred between schools and families to ensure that the learning community was aware of what was happening, that there was a lot of transparency, and that questions were being answered. One teacher commented that, that she found that her bond with students really grew because it gave more time to connect with students and connect with their families, particularly under these different circumstances. Advances in teaching and learning. So this was another theme that we noted. The teachers reported the takeaways from online learning would be utilized when returning to the classroom. And Amber, you mentioned this, how you then utilize this in your practice. And so I expect that many of the teachers who have returned to the classroom are likely using many of the technologies, having students prepare in the event that they do need to move back to fully online learning, but also recognizing that many of these tools can enhance digital literacies and can be used in a face-to-face classroom as well. There were also many challenges that were noticed by our participants. So one that I'll comment on is that that assessment was noted as a challenge. And, you know, I mentioned the standardized exams already, how, you know, many of our participants discussed how it was a relief to, you know, to not have that additional pressure and stress of preparation for standardized exams. Yet there was also a challenge in terms of making sure that assessment was fair, and that, you know, that students were completing the assessments on their own and not with the assistance of others. And so I think that continues to challenge us in the ways in which we are designing assessment, assessing students in multiple ways, rather than perhaps relying on one method that might be more difficult to assess in an online environment. So, you know, as a community, I think there's continuation of, you know, questioning assessments. You know, are standardized assessments needed during a time of crisis? You know, often there's a conversation around they're needed to enter post-secondary education, and so that's why the students have to write standardized exams, or we need them to, you know, we need to give them these exams so that they can prepare for post-secondary. I think a different question we could ask is, you know, how are we preparing students digital literacy wise so that they're prepared for post-secondary, rather than looking at being able to write a multiple choice exam. So then we might ask, as a participant did in our study, how do we thread all of this together so that we can raise the bar for everybody when we come back to a totally uncertain future? And, you know, and I'll remind you that this was a question posed by a participant in the spring. So again, not knowing what school might look like in the fall. So Amber, I'm going to ask you to jump in again here and share some of your thoughts about what do we need to do? How do we thread this all together?
Thanks, Barb. Yeah, this was a question that really touched me and made me think, because coming back into a K to 12 setting and just thinking about how complex the learning environment is, or it was going to be, and it is, it made me think about how do we really just provide a good learning and optimal learning environment for students. And I, for me, it came down to a few key components. And the first and foremost is making sure that we are acting in the best interests of our students, while ensuring that everyone in education feels safe. Because to me, the biggest component of this is the feeling of being safe in your learning environment. And I see that if we are offering the different options for all learners, then, and for staff, teachers as well, then they are able to find a delivery model in which they can feel safe in having their learning needs met. So whether that be fully face-to-face, or if it's a distance model, completely distance, or if it's a blended format where students are in some days and then are at home other days, just to ensure that they're still getting their needs met. The second component to me is ensuring that we develop the skills and capacities in our teachers and administrators and policymakers to be able to effectively provide such options. So as we've all experienced, moving to online is not as easy as just flicking a switch or turning on a computer screen and creating a D2L classroom or a Google Classroom or a Moodle. There needs to be intentional design and pedagogical thought that goes into those the creation of those environments. And there is research in that area, and there are models that can be used. However, do our teachers and administrators and policymakers have the professional learning in that area to be successful in such an environment? So we need to be providing the time, the resources, and the professional development to all of these key stakeholders to ensure that the learning environments are being created to ensure quality learning. The third part of that is to also educate parents. And making sure that we have the family connection and the parents understand, and that communication is home, so they understand the choices and the rationale and the reasons behind the design decisions that we're making, so we can all be making informed decisions as to what's best for our students and our children. And then finally, that last piece is preparing the students to be able to successfully learn in any of these environments. Even if it's not blended or online now, as Barb has mentioned, there is a chance that we will end up in a situation where students are back at home, distance, or in a blended format. And we need to ensure that while we have this time with them right now, whether it be face-to-face or online, and things are semi-stable, that we are ensuring that kids have the digital skills and the digital fluency that they require to be successful in navigating these technologies. For example, this school year, my focus has been on, first of all, creating those PD opportunities for the teachers so they know how to be successful in synchronous and asynchronous environments in ways that engage, not just in terms of stand and deliver instruction, and setting up the structures for teachers to use those online resources. Good change theory, we know, says, script those critical moves at the beginning. So whatever I can do in my role to take some of the difficulties associated with technology, such as uploading class lists and ensuring students have their usernames and passwords set, then I'm going to do that to support my colleagues in being able to transition and use the tools with their students. And with that too, for me, I feel a lot of it is protocols and communication and having those phone calls with parents when they are concerned and they have questions. So there's a lot of moving pieces, but overall it is possible and we can do it. It's just a matter of making those critical decisions and scripting those moves right now, so we are prepared for what could be possible.
Thank you, Amber. I think this might be a good moment to take a look at one of the questions that I see in the Q&A. And the question is, after the pandemic is no longer affecting how education is delivered, are these some programs, courses, which could or even should still be offered online? And so what I'm hearing you say is that, you know, what we're learning from this experience, and certainly what you know from your experience and having taken, you know, a master's program that was blended with, you know, a lot of online courses, and now being part of a doctoral program also with online courses. You know, I think I know what your response would be to this question, Amber, but just wondering what are your comments in terms of what things should continue to be offered online?
Yes, thanks, Barb. So definitely, if a course is able to be transitioned into online and after pandemic, I would be in favor and encouraging of still continuing to have those courses offered online for students. There has been some great research that has come out recently that shows how online coursework can support particular learning groups and help students graduate and be successful in school. So, for example, a 2019 study by Hart found that peers who retook courses in an online setting were 5% more likely to pass than students who didn't retake those courses online and retook them face-to-face. And there's been research that's come out recently too that shows that students with learning disabilities who take courses online, that increases their likelihood of succeeding throughout their K-12 education. So there's a lot of benefits and a lot of promise in offering online courses. So no, don't shelve them away after all of this is done. Keep them going and provide that choice for our learners so we can be meeting all of our diverse needs.
Great, thank you, Amber. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of the emerging themes that I discussed from the focus groups and interviews that were conducted in the spring, how they relate to an earlier study that again was conducted with a team of researchers from the Workland School of Education, where we studied high schools in Alberta that were undergoing redesign. And so high schools have been undergoing redesign for a number of years now. And our study took a look at 7 schools in the province that were deemed as successfully undergoing redesign. So they were making changes to their school, you know, to meet student needs, to increase graduation rates, to allow for students to, you know, engage in deep learning and utilize the amount of time that they needed to study a particular subject, not the amount of time that was dictated through a schedule. And so when I took a look at our findings from that and put them together with the findings from the spring, I noticed that there were some similarities. And so when we talked about the teachers and principals and superintendents reporting this collective disposition that was required during a time of crisis, this was really similar to a collective disposition that was also communicated by principals and teachers that were engaged in high school redesign and making significant changes in their school. What was a little bit different in the spring is that we noticed that emphasis on wellness. And we're also noticing an emphasis on wellness more broadly. And so it could be why we saw that in the spring as well. But anyway, I just wanted to share that kind of similarity, but also a little bit of a difference. There was also this focus on relationship building, both in the high school study as well as in the spring. But in terms of relationships, what we noticed is that in the spring, there was more conversation around the relationships with families, Whereas in the high school study, which makes sense to me, the relationship part was more with students and making sure that student voice was heard in terms of the changes that were occurring in the high school. Whereas in the spring, we heard more about the relationships with students and their families to ensure that their needs were being met and that they were, learning about the changes that were occurring and being part of the learning situation, whatever that was in their school. So as I mentioned in the high school study, gathering student input was really important. In the spring, the communications and the personal connections with students and families was important. Collaboration was critical in terms of the changes that took place in those high schools and being able to be successful in their redesign. Collaboration was also important in the spring, but what we noticed on top of that was this added dedication to improving digital literacies, both for teachers and students. So what we noticed in the high school study is when they talked about teaching and learning specifically, that there were changes that were needed in terms of assessment and the types of learning tasks and the way that they were designed. We noticed a move towards interdisciplinary learning, teachers working together to design more interdisciplinary learning opportunities for students, noting that learning outcomes could be met in multiple ways and across different subject areas and not only in one specific discipline on its own. And we noticed that as well in terms of the spring, that there were these advances to teaching and learning that were communicated, and also an emphasis on assessment, similar to the emphasis on assessment that we saw in the high school study years ago. So next, what I'd like to do, now that we've heard about what was happening in the spring and how that compares or contrasts to other research in terms of schools that are undergoing change, what I'd like to do is debunk some of the myths around online learning. What happened in the spring, as I mentioned before, was really remote learning during a crisis. It wasn't strong online learning that has time for, as Amber mentioned, instructors to have the professional learning, the training to be able to design quality online learning, nor did it provide time for students themselves to become online learners. So for example, in our graduate programs, when students come into our program, we provide orientations for the students and provide them with an opportunity to learn about how to be an online learner. All of those things were really difficult to do in a quick time period in the spring. So what are some of the implications for, as I say, an action-oriented approach to ensure that all learners are provided with equitable access? One of the things that I would argue is that we need to consider some of these myths around online learning and consider debunking them. And so one of the myths that I'll talk about is one that we hear as an underlying message in some of the different communications around us. So online learning is less effective than in-person learning. We know is a myth. It's been proven that learning online can be effective, and it can be effective particularly for a diverse range of learners. So there isn't a particular type of student that is better suited to learn online. There's students who have skills that might support them better in terms of learning online, but other students who might need to learn or sharpen those skills in order to find online learning more effective. So as I mentioned, online learning has been proven to be effective. The research tells us that. And there's a lot of research out there. One that I'll mention, Donovan and colleagues in 2019, for example, discussed how blended and hybrid learning, so different types of online learning, have been proven to be an important part of, and this study looked at Canadian post-secondary education. So this was prior to the COVID pandemic, but we were already seeing very current results, and there's older research as well, but I tried to point out some newer research Barber and colleagues as well indicated that approximately 300,000 K-12 students in Canada were engaged in distance or online learning in 2018-19. So that number has definitely changed now, but that was back a few years, and already we had a large number of students that were engaged in online learning, and results already showing that this can be done effectively as long as our instructors have the professional learning that they need, the time that they need to design online learning effectively, and that learners also have the time that they need to learn how to be effective online learners. So Amber, I'm going to invite you to jump in and add to any of these points before we go on to the next myth.
Some of the research I've looked at specifically around how online courses are successful has really highlighted some of the key design tools or skill activities that you can do with your learners to enhance the likelihood of students being successful. Looking in the last, since 2014 is where all this research comes from. If you embed self-reflection into your course design, it has been proven to increase student engagement. And students will be more successful if you provide problem-solving activities, if you engage them in teamwork, which still can be done through breakout rooms with Zoom. You're still using those knowledge building activities and providing teacher scaffolding, allowing for active and project-based learning, which can be done quite easily remotely as well through breakout rooms and Zoom. But even if you're doing a blended model, I know that for myself, when I was conducting my master's work in flipped classroom research, that active learning was a significant theme in my research and focus. And of course, embedding ongoing formative assessment. So if you are continually building in those formative feedback loops for your learners through discussion boards or even like video feedback, those kind of tools and approaches have proven through research to increase the success of your students in online environments.
That's great. Thank you, Amber. I'm just looking at the Q&A and just wondering if this might be an opportunity for us to maybe answer a couple questions before we move on to the other myths. So I'm looking at one question here. Any advice for how to maintain the positive changes amid the rush to return to normal? What a great question. I think that's one of the challenges that we're all experiencing, is that we've learned so much from this opportunity in the spring to try out remote learning, and how do we make sure we take from the best what we've learned and continue to incorporate that, and not try to revert back to education as it was before. I think that there's a lot that we can definitely learn from this. And when we talk about online learning being as effective as in-person learning, I think that's a key message that we can take with us in terms of moving forward and starting to redesign, reimagine what education can look like. See another question about, in this new reality in schooling, would we consider one-to-one devices for students to be critical so that students can learn in all three scenarios? Amber, I'm not sure what is happening in your school regarding devices, but I know that there's, there have been some schools who have questioned, whether students should be allowed to use their own devices when they're in school. Some are, requiring cell phones and devices to be locked up or not brought to the school. I'm not, again, I'm not sure what the status is at your particular school, but just wondering, how might we leverage the devices? And, and I think we're beyond one-to-one for many students, and, and could make devices available to those students who might need them. So wondering what's happening in your setting, Amber.
Right. So my current school district has sent out a message district-wide that has said we encourage you to be bringing your own personal devices, including laptops and Chromebooks. Which is not traditionally what we've seen in many K-12 schools due to concerns about theft and vandalism and security and getting onto the networks and those types of concerns I've heard previously. But my district even went as far as to work out volume purchasing agreements with their vendors so they could provide the devices that the schools purchase for families to purchase at the discounted price as well. So what we're seeing in the current school that I work in is just over 800 students, and we are very technology rich here. So every classroom already has 15 Chromebooks per classroom for every 25 to 30 students. So when we factor in the personal devices coming in from home, what we're seeing is there's not that much of a gap anymore. And then plus the Library Learning Commons has additional devices that teachers can sign out. But what we're seeing is that now that encouragement or that push for students to bring their own devices, which is quite unique because as well, we don't have lockers this year for students. So the students are bringing their backpack and all of their belongings to every class with them. And if we are using devices, school devices with classes, we are cleaning them, all four sides of them after every single student use. So if we have those personal devices, then the students can just have their own dedicated device. Understanding though that that's not the reality for all learners, especially when we went remote. Our school district also provided the option for families to take home devices during the pandemic so we could connect. So it's been nice to see that encouragement of personal devices coming to school and allowing students to work with their own devices. And then it's a matter of making sure that they're compatible with our networks. But it's definitely something that I would say if you are able to afford to have some form of a notebook or a laptop for your children, it definitely will help them just with the ease of access both in their classroom and at home.
Great. Thank you, Amber. And I think another question that's come up in the Q&A is in terms of supporting children that are at home. And so I do have one of my kids is at home and online learning. And one of the, and I certainly don't have the answers for this in terms of, how to best support, children at different ages that are learning from home. But one of the things that I have found that has been really helpful is to communicate a lot, to make sure that, that you're hearing the kids, to find out what it is they need in terms of supports, because I think the supports are all going to be different dependent on the child. But, like for today, for example, I took a walk at lunch with my daughter, and we went outside for half an hour, walked and just chatted together so that she could tell me about her learning this morning and the classes that she was in and what she's working on. So that's something, like we both looked at it as, wow, here's an opportunity. Like she said, it kind of feels like kindergarten year again, where we do get to have some time together during the day. And so I think, taking those micro breaks are so important for everyone's wellness, but also to just keep really connected to each other's needs. I'm going to go on to the second myth. Online learning implies less interaction than in person. And I hear this quite often in terms of, how do you get to know each other when you're working online? It's something that we worry about with our children that are in online classes. Are they going to have the same kind of connections? Do we need to make connections or help them make more connections on the weekends or in the evenings so that they are keeping connected with other children? How are they connecting with the students that they're learning with online? Are they exchanging connection information? So I know that when I was talking to my daughter today, she talked about they exchanged some social media information so that they could create, smaller groups and be able to connect with each other outside of class. And so I think a lot of the kids, depending on the ages that they're at, will do this automatically, but they might need some supports in doing this. Again, dependent on their age, they might need some supports to make those connections, to make sure that there is that interaction. And I think I'm going to, just looking at the time, I'm going to go on to the next one, is number 3. So more time should be spent on synchronous activities and online classes. And again, this one, instructors always ask me, how much time should I be spending on synchronous versus asynchronous? There's the sense that, if I'm teaching the class, I would normally have this many hours per week. So do I need to have the same amount of synchronous time as I would if I were teaching the class? And certainly the research indicates that, that it's good to have a balance of synchronous and asynchronous activities. And I should define those terms. So synchronous being, when we're together, we see each other like we are now, versus asynchronous activities that would be perhaps in a learning management system, maybe in Seesaw or Google Classroom or Desire to Learn, whatever system the jurisdiction is using. And those activities might take place on your own time, where you decide when you're going to contribute and how you're going to interact with the material. And the research tells us that it's good to have a balance. So certainly having too much synchronous time can also be really difficult, physically in terms of being in front of a screen for a long period of time. So I think balancing that and making sure that you're not having too much of one or the other. Okay, Amber, I am going to, unless you want to add anything, I thought I would move on to the next.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Amber, to talk. I know the audience would love to hear a little bit more about your experience as a graduate student, and unexpectedly, you were planning to come to Calgary in the summer and meet your cohort, start your doctoral experience, and then you were told, no, it's all online. So tell us a bit about how that experience was for you.
Yeah, so, this is actually going to touch on one of the myths that you were setting out to debunk in that last slide there. For me, it was probably quite similar to a lot of, to any other student, even with a background of online learning and knowing that I can be successful in that environment. At first, I was still quite disappointed and upset because I was really looking forward to being back on campus in Calgary and getting to meet everybody face to face and make those relationships with my cohort, going through that similar process with my master's. That time face to face with my peers really helped build relationships that have lasted even to this day, that helped me on my master's journey and made it as successful as it was. There were attempts and some good strategies that we used with our instructors and as well within our peer group, like your daughter did, with using social media and other avenues to build a relationship. So we have a WhatsApp conversation to keep us going while we are all distanced from one another. One of the other struggles I found was because my course was originally a 2-week intensive, well, there were 2 courses, 2-week intensives on campus. When we shifted from face-to-face to online, the duration extended from 2 weeks to 6 weeks. So that was a bit of a difficult navigation, having a little baby at home and having our plans about how we were going to support me while I went to school and still have a 6-month-old at home. So it was a bit difficult to figure out a 6-week plan rather than a 2-week plan. And at times I questioned, did it really need to be extended? And when we talk about that third myth, Barb, about do we have to have just as much face-to-face time, and do we need to be piling on all of this work? At times I wondered, are we doing this because of the fact that we aren't face-to-face and having these discussions online, and just to make sure that the readings were getting done? And I felt that there was a high level of rigor, but at times I felt like it was a lot as well, and began to really understand what it was like when it was May and June for K to 12 students, and hearing the message, teachers cut back, it's too much going home, families are overwhelmed because yeah, just navigating through a pandemic and making sure that your basic needs of health and safety are being met really can drain somebody quite a bit. But what I will say was that there were a lot of positives that came out of it too. So while I wasn't planning on 6 weeks, the 6 weeks also gave me more time to be able to reflect and to be able to work on my final papers and to get other people to read over and, take a look at my work before I handed it in, and to get more perspectives on it. And we were able to form an online reading group so we could meet and discuss readings outside of our formal gatherings with our teacher. And then again, that WhatsApp that I talked about, just having that back channel. So we always knew that we were there for each other, and sending photos or sending little links. It was really helpful in terms of navigating and adjusting to our new and unexpected norm. Yeah.
So Amber, I'm going to ask you, there's a question in the Q&A about kind of onboarding techniques. So as you know, as a student in an online environment, and also as an instructor, you have experience teaching in online as well. What would you say are some onboarding strategies or suggestions that you would make in terms of supporting students who may not be familiar or have not taken online courses and might need some help with that?
So some of the key critical steps for me when I'm teaching with kids online, is teaching with any learner online, is making sure first and foremost that they have the access. So for example, right now, as I mentioned, everything I do right now revolves around making sure 820 students can access their computers and their Gmail tools. Once you have that students have access, it's a matter of, Zoom is great for, and there's other video conferencing tools, but they're great for being able to share your screen and great for being able to create quick videos as well. So showing learners how to navigate to the content page or where you're uploading your work, and showing them step by step how to download and rename a file and save a file. From my experience, even in all of K to 12, is understanding that a lot of the skills and things that we expect students to know, they might not necessarily know. So a simple thing as downloading a file and renaming it, students might not have ever have done that before. One of the big wow moments for me was when I asked students to double space and half the class was using the enter key to double space. So remembering that that there might not have has never been an opportunity for that explicit instruction on how to actually use these digital tools. And with that is also being able to find those transliteracy moments where they're able to transfer skills from one area to another. So for example, if kids know how to use Microsoft Word, can that transfer into Google Docs? Or if you've used D2L before, what is similar to that in Google Classroom? And really using those nuggets to help make those connections and help make the learning environment a lot easier. Videos are always going to be helpful in making sure that they are posted somewhere and titled properly so students can use them. Even today, with everything that I'm doing, I'm recording it and uploading it to our virtual learning commons at the school for teachers and for students, because we're getting hit with so much information right now and so many new tools and so many new workarounds that it's hard to remember all of that. So really taking the time, and your videos don't have to be pretty. It's a matter of getting them out there, and remembering too that we are our own worst critics. So we think it might not be good, but 3/4 of that nobody else notices. So just making sure first and foremost access, and then taking the time to walk students through what you need them to do.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Amber. And I'm thinking of some of the other work that you've done in terms of flipped classrooms. one of the questions here in the Q&A is around families whose first language is not English, and perhaps how are they dealing with this particular transition, and has any research been done in this area? So one of the things that I would like to share related to this is that one of the schools that was part of that study, that or districts that I talked about earlier, has a large portion of their families do speak other languages at home. And what they did find is that having the teachers who had used a flipped model in their teaching prior to the pandemic and prior to having to move to online learning, that was really supportive in the transition. And that having videos, as you say, Amber, and they don't need to be polished theater quality type videos. They can be kind of grassroots. That having that video or digital artifact was really supportive, because they could slow it down, they could watch it multiple times. And so this was really supportive to both children as well as their families, who perhaps needed that extra support if English was not their first language.
I just want to add to that too, Barb, with that work that was done with, that I did with the flipped classroom, was one of the biggest takeaways. I still remember the student's face to this day, was an English language learner student who came in, and he was in my partner teacher's class, and he said, "I just want to thank you so much for making those videos, because they helped me learn." And I said, I asked, how so? Like, how are they helpful compared to other videos on YouTube? And he said, it's because it was in my language, it was in our school language, and so I used vocabulary that the students could understand that was being reinforced in class. And that really drove it home to me as to the value of making the videos myself, rather than trying to find the technology to fit the task, which we talk about in ed tech, about, the task determines the technology. So while sometimes you might be able to be lucky and find a great video on Khan Academy or YouTube, if we're really looking at designing for what's best for our learners, what I found was the actual teacher making the lesson is going to have the greatest impact on student success. That's what I took away from that. And 6 years later, I still see that grade 9 student's face in my mind all of the time.
Okay, no, that's great. Okay, so I know that we're getting close to time, Amber. So just any last comments in terms of the realities of back to school?
Yes, so back to school, the overalling theme has been everything is different, right? So we, as students walked into the building being uncertain, as parents walked into the building, teachers, we were walking into the building uncertain about timetables, about what students we would be seeing again, uncertain about whether the PPE would be there. The magnitude of change was tremendous. Everything from how you enter and exit a building, to washing your hands, to access to resources, things like not having a locker. If you were learning online, are you going to know anyone in your class? Or what is your day schedule going to look like? Are you going to be spending 6 hours on Zoom a day, or will you be more self-directed? Will there be opportunities for you to engage? And again, redefining roles. I, as a Learning Commons teacher, I wear many hats as it is, but this year I feel like I have a pile of about 100 hats on my head, and just making sure that I can go wherever it is to support my colleagues. So know that if you are a teacher, it's everywhere, that we are all feeling that uncertainty, and that it is a time of flux and a lot of understanding and flexibility, more so than we're used to. So to everyone that is a teacher out there, like, you're doing a good job. Just keep going.
Thank you, Amber. And just to wrap things up, I know we didn't get to all of the questions in the Q&A, and certainly both Amber and I are happy to respond to any of your questions. Personally, if you'd like to reach out to us, I also would like to share with you a program that we've currently been running now for 3 years in our graduate programs at the Workland School of Education, and that's Leading and Learning in a Digital Age. And it's 4 courses that are all fully online starting in the summer and going through 1 course per term. And it's a master's level program that does ladder into a Master's of Education program, or can just be taken for professional learning purposes. You can take the 1 or 2 courses as open studies, or you can take all 4 if you select to do that. So I just wanted to share that program with you. Many of the students who have taken that program have indicated that it was really supportive for them as they transition to online, blended, and different hybrid models. And so I encourage you to look that up if that's something that's of interest to you. We are also in the process of designing coursework for teachers who might be interested also in taking courses as open study students in the summertime. So I just thought I would let you know about that. And Amber, I'm just going to turn it over to you for some closing thank you remarks.
Thanks, Barb. Yeah, so yeah, there's a few questions we didn't get to, so if you would like us to answer them, feel free to email us, and Barb and I are more than happy to continue this conversation. On behalf of Barb and I would like to thank you all for joining us today for our program on implications of learning in a digital age, and we hope that you were able to take away something today from our presentation, and we look forward to connecting with each and every one of you again at another date. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.